lines about everything before now being a preparation for this moment. And as I came here, the taxi driver was practicing his English and he kept on saying, "Good luck, good luck, good luck." So anyway, I'd like to share those sentiments with you for today's lecture. So I can't remember how many times I've done this lecture to JMEC, and it's the same every year, but just a little bit better every year, I hope. So in terms of what we're going to get through today, hopefully we'll have a good understanding of why we do market research. Market research is not always carried out. It says in the textbook you're supposed to do it. Businesses are supposed to research important decisions among the people that those decisions affect, or those people among whom they need the cooperation to make those decisions profitable. But businesses don't always do market research, so it's good to kind of check in and say, why would we actually go through this exercise? We will also look at just basically the broad process and the main approaches that we use in market research. Now, just because a process is a generally used process in market research does not mean that you need to use it to come to a good recommendation in your plan. So there are different types of research and there are different sort of levels you can go down, and not all of your projects are going to suit, for example, doing a survey, for example. And we'll talk about that as we go through, you know, what would be a good situation to do a certain methodology versus another. And then we'll apply this to a real business plan, and the business plan that I'm going to take you through is the business plan that was made for me when I was a project client. So I'm going to give you the same brief that I gave to the project team. And they did a very good job on the research part of their plan. They did a very good job overall, and they actually won the competition. So it's a good, it's a good case study. I think it works to have some real life examples and just to get you thinking about how you would start to apply what you've learned to a real case study. So that's what we're going to do by 5 o'clock this afternoon. So why would you ignore market research? I can't believe anybody would ignore it. It's like my life's work, and it's tragic. But actually there are some very good reasons why people don't do research, and when they do research, that the research does not get listened to. So first of all, it slows things down. Actually, it takes a lot of time to do research properly. There's a lot of preparation involved. You have to plan out what you're going to do. You have to line up the resources. You have to find partners that you might feel simpatico with to work with, and that all takes time. And oftentimes people just want to rush in. They feel very confident about what they're doing. They strongly believe that they've got a meaningfully differentiated offer to the market, and they just want to get started. And there's nothing more annoying than having a market researcher come along and challenge the basic relevancy of what you're trying to do. There's a lot of process involved in market research when it's done properly. There are degrees of structure that you have in research. You go from completely unstructured forms of research, which might just be observation, walking around, having a look at things, looking at some typical, if it's a consumer setting, looking at some typical consumers in a store, what are they doing? Very, very informal, to these very, very highly structured questionnaires that are where the way that the questions are asked has been thought about, and possibly these questions have been asked thousands and thousands of times before, and you've built up a database of typical response patterns for questions like that. So there are different levels of complexity, but there usually is some process there, and business demands process. You have to be able to say to your boss or to your internal client, this is the process that we went through to come to this conclusion. You can't just say, oh look, we had a hunch and we did a bit of work and we backed it up, kind of thing. It's expensive too, in dollars and yen, I'm afraid. A typical, a very, very typical small-scale project might set the client back $20,000 or $30,000, and that's just for a very small one. And there are other There are other projects that run into the millions and millions. So I mean, we have projects in my company that run, tracking studies that run into the millions of dollars in terms of the yearly contract on that. So there's very small scale and there's very large scale, but generally it's quite expensive, and people who are not used to doing research are usually surprised at how much it costs. And you don't have a budget. Well, maybe you've got, I don't know what you've got, $500 or something. So we also need to, when you're thinking about how you do your research, you need to think about, well, no, I don't have the budget to do a 500 people survey. And I have to do this basically for free. So how do we do that? How do we compromise? So there's no point for me coming and talking to you about how big companies do research if you don't have the budget to do it. But certainly there are some learnings and ways of approaching things that you can learn and you can apply. It can be scary for people who are running businesses to kind of have that sort of objective consumer perspective. It can lead to them losing control over a project. You may have a very strongly held conviction which is based on experience. Most people don't just make things up, but they have a history and so forth of how they got to the point of believing what they believe. But of course, the moment that you bring external researchers into the equation, the risk of you losing control over your project is there. So you can sometimes get quite emotional responses to objective facts. It just is human nature. And it sort of related to that, research can contradict some powerful people. So occasionally I might give a presentation and I'll realise, oh dear, like what I just said is completely opposite to what this client thinks. Or oftentimes what this part of the client thinks versus this part. And we're often in the situation where there's a foreign stakeholder and there's a Japanese stakeholder, and the local stakeholder and the foreign stakeholder will often have a differing opinion on how things work, and then research comes in as an objective touchstone in that process to really sort of work out what to do sometimes. But it can contradict powerful people. And people also feel they know it already a lot of the time, so why do we need to do research? Because we know how our market works. Although I've rarely seen a situation where we haven't brought new information into the mix for a client. And it makes you think differently, and sometimes people don't want to think differently. I don't believe that describes the project clients of JMEC. I think they actually have a lot of courage in terms of handing over their plans to you guys. They're actually very open-minded. So this probably doesn't apply so much to your project client, but there will be people in the project client who will attack what you do because of that kind of stuff if they don't agree with it. So you've got to be really confident and solid in terms of the decisions that you've made in doing the research that you do. And I think research can be a great help to those who are open to receiving it. It's not just about facts and figures and collecting as much information as possible. It does play a role in helping us to see the business environment in new ways and to see opportunities that you may never have thought of before. Sometimes when we're doing our work, for example in a focus group, I'll talk a bit more about what a focus group is. But someone in a focus group might say something particularly insightful or something that particularly summarises the client's challenge or gives a really, really good idea on how to approach that challenge. And you may not have thought of that before. And of course that's why you do research, is to do something new. And sparking ideas is I think a very important role of research. And again, not necessarily the way that a lot of people think of research immediately, but research as that kind of like precursor to ideation and so forth. It is pretty good, and you're doing it off a base that's objective, as much as possible objective, which is good. However, like the spark of an idea can sometimes be a bit of a lead to something that's a bit of a disaster. So there is a role of research in testing ideas too. So it's not just about sparking them, it's about testing them. So we had a great idea, and we tested it, and yes, everyone said it was a great idea that we spoke to. Funny that. So it has, research does have that role in creating ideas, inspiring ideas, but also validating those ideas. Now what your clients are really looking for are ideas that they can't get to themselves. They know their categories extremely well. So you don't want to be in the position where you do all of this work and you're simply playing back to the client what they already know. That's a bit of a disaster from the client's perspective. So they're looking for ideas from you, and they're looking for your insights. So has everyone heard that word insights before? Yeah, it's actually a very overused word, and there are many there are many different definitions of an insight. But an insight is, generally speaking, when you're presented with a whole series of data or information or scraps of stuff, and then you put it together into a whole, and you're able to come up with an overall idea, and we call that an insight. And this fellow Stan, I can't pronounce his last name, but I saw him speak at a conference in the States, and he had a very good point about insight, is that, well, how do you know when you've had a real insight? And he said, well, it's always retrospectively self-evident. So it's kind of like before you came up with the insight, you were kind of struggling with the idea, and then afterwards you're like, oh yeah, well of course it is like that. So that's kind of how so there's a bit of like a nose test, if you like. You'll have a sense as to whether you've come to a really good insight, and sometimes you'll have to you'll have to explain to your client in detail how you got to that insight. But if they can follow you along that path of thinking, then I think you're good. So how do you get to good insights? So none of us in this room are completely inexperienced in work or in life, and I think that you should not underestimate the value of your own experience and things that you have learned up until now. So that doesn't mean you don't come to things with an open mind, but your own experience is very, very powerful. You also need to look at the market context. So we need to understand, yes, we are working in Japan, we're not in America or Europe or Australia. It's different. So we have to understand how things generally are in Japan, things that are generally what we would call common sense. And common sense is like a really interesting idea because it's very, very culturally driven. What a Japanese housewife would think is common sense is actually quite different than what an Australian housewife would think is common sense in some respects. But that's where sort of, having an awareness of culture and so forth is important. And you may have to kind of modify your own experience when thinking about the market that you're in. And of course, new information. So new information is what we're trying to get out of our research process. But my point here is that the new information is really only going to be useful, or it's going to be most useful when you can sort of combine it with those things as well. So put another way, you need to discuss what comes through the process in the team. Maybe it's needless to say, but it's not a case of, well, who did the research, who's the team member responsible for that, or the two people on the team responsible for that, and what did they say, and we just do it. So there are two types of research we generally refer to. The first is secondary research. Is everyone familiar with that term, secondary research? It's basically research that's been prepared by other people. So it would be, surveys that other people have done. It could even be facts and figures that are quoted in articles, and you might go back to the source of those data. Anything that someone else has written on a topic or work that they've done on a topic, we would refer to as a secondary source. And then you have primary research. So that's research that you carry out yourself. And that's the expensive stuff because you've got to do all the planning and preparation and the work. Secondary, it's already been done, And there are companies that sell secondary research too, so you can buy secondary research reports. But primary research, you plan that research out yourself. And it's broken into two main areas. The first is qualitative research, or qual. So we call that qual. So I'm going to call it qual, so you know what that is. And then the other one is quant, so quantitative research. So quantitative research is, you know, as you can imagine, has to do with measurement and numbers and all of that. And qualitative research is more about sort of your overall sense of things and your overall feelings. It's a little bit more than feelings, but you know, if you compare it to quant, for people who are quantitative experts, qual seems very fluffy. And I started my career mostly doing quantitative work, and over the years I've done more and more qualitative work, and I really think that both of them have a very distinct role to play. I don't think one is superior to the other. I think it's just a fit to what the actual task is that you need to do. So if we look at the process of developing the ideas in your plan, there's a very early stage. You're sparking, you're scoping, you're tossing things around in the team. Then you're developing your ideas, and then you're testing your ideas, and then you're selling your ideas. Maybe it's not so linear as that, but if you look at the stages of developing your thinking and the plan, and you look at what we're doing, so here we're sort of exploring early stage. We're involved in exploration. As we move further down, we're moving into measurement, and we're more about kind of justifying what we've done. So this is about finding some kind of evidence and support for some of the decisions that you want to lay out for your client. And then afterwards, you know, we need to go into that almost justification phase. I mean, like, it would be perfect if you could just run a survey at the end and just and then the people who were answering the survey just confirmed everything you wanted to do, and then it's done and dusted, and you just sow the financials and you're done. I mean, it's not quite that simple, but that's generally how it tends to develop. So early on, you're doing secondary research, so that's research other people have done. Observation might be part of that as well, just very sort of unstructured kind of engagement with the issue, with the business, with the category. Then you may move into qualitative research, which I'll explain what that is in more detail in a moment, and then quantitative research, which I'll also go into. I would say that I just want to make the distinction between exploration and measurement clear, or I want you to have at least to start thinking about what the difference is between exploration and measurement. So exploration, I think we know what the word means, but doing a survey where you're asking people to tick boxes on a questionnaire is not really exploratory. Because you've defined the parameters. So there's not much exploration involved in that. It's just a case of seeing to what degree people kind of, you know, fall into what you've already decided are the parameters of that issue. Which doesn't mean that a survey is not appropriate. It's just kind of, you know, this is when do you do it? Exploratory research at the early stages is, you know, the right way to do it. And it was interesting for me as a client when my team, one of the first meetings that we had, the team said, oh, here's our questionnaire. So we've been really proactive in our planning, and here's our questionnaire. And I looked at it and I said, take that thing away from me. I don't want to see it. I don't want to see your stupid questionnaire. Go back and do what I told you to do, which is unstructured work. And I found as a client that the more interesting stuff for me was the unstructured stuff, because the possibility of discovery is much higher when you take that approach. The possibility of creativity and new ideas is much higher if you're not forcing questionnaires down people's throats, right? But there will be a time when that will be appropriate for some plans. But let's say if your plan, I mean, I don't know any of the project clients this year, I've no idea, but, you know, if it's like nuclear power generator client coming into the country. I mean, how many customers are there for that? So who are you going to survey? With like one customer or two customers? If it's a very, if it's infrastructure related project, and there have been infrastructure related projects before, then yes, I mean, who are you going to survey? Well, you might survey the general public to see what their issues may be with an infrastructure plan, but the people who really make the decisions who you need to build the plan around it are not, there's not even going to be enough of them for you to do a survey. And if you get the chance to speak to somebody, why would you give them a ticker box list and get them to fill it out? You want to talk to them. So it's talking to people, really. So anyway, we'll get into that kind of exploring and measuring thing, and we may even do it as you go through in your plans as well. There may be a chance for me to look at some of the stuff that you're doing and maybe challenge it. So what's exploratory research? It's necessary when you don't even know what it is that you need to measure. But you're not even going to know what those things are at the early stages. It relies heavily on secondary research and qualitative research. And what are the kinds of things when we look at secondary research in particular that we can be looking at? Things like market size, growth rates, key segments. You can look at the structure of the population. You can say, well, why are, for example, handbag sales dropping in Japan? Well, because there are so few people now in that 20 segment. There just are so few people coming through, younger people, in those areas of the population that previously had a lot of people going through, for example. So you can look at some of those overall big picture things. Consumer end user trends, there'll often be stuff written up in the press about what young people are doing, what those trends are. I don't know how real those trends are some of the time, but at least gives you something to start talking about. It may even start giving you a thought about, who's the persona. If it's a consumer project, then who's the persona? What does the typical buyer look like? Who are we trying to target? If we're looking for early adopters, what would that profile of person look like? Look at the competitive environment. So who are the players? How do they position their products and services? How does pricing work? Look at industry trends, distribution factors. That can be a major issue in Japan. Distribution channels are different here usually than what they are overseas. That's changing, but still in a lot of categories there are kind of unique characteristics there. And then the regulatory environment is also very, very important. I've been working with a client for 3 years now, and they're still looking at, they're a skincare client, they're still looking at regulatory issues. If I put this formula in, so chemical X, we know that it irons out wrinkles in 4 weeks, but it's illegal. Or we know that our product, or it's legal, and we know that it works, but we can't say that it works. Those sorts of things. So there are restrictions over how you can formulate your product. There are restrictions over what you can say about your products. And if your product requires you to say something that is, unique and out there to get people interested in it, if you can't say that, it's a problem. And you'll need, oftentimes, research to sort of get through, well, what can we say, and how do we say it, and how do we make that effective? But anyway, that kind of stuff you can start to be getting out of secondary research. So where can you get this? I would say work your client as well. They should have a good idea over what some of these sources are. They may even have their own internal libraries. And sometimes, as I mentioned before, you can buy secondary research, but it can be quite expensive. Some of these reports can be $20,000 just to get from a company like Euromonitor or other such companies. You can buy a report from them which will be like, here's the landscape in the ball bearing industry in Japan. And they have a business which, they survey all the ball bearer makers or whatever, but I mean, you're not going to be able to find it on a Google search. So your client may have some of that stuff there, and if they're a completely new entrant, they may well have invested in it. So I would work them and just see what they've got in that respect. Company reports also, that kind of thing can be potentially useful. And of course you'll be relying on the Japanese members in your team, if those sources are in Japanese too, to do that. I also think I don't want to distract you too much off the focus of Japan too, but there are models of success overseas for these businesses as well. So you may want to search around. I wouldn't spend too much time in it, but you may want to search around and see how these businesses work overseas, and start to think about how they may adapt in here. External, well, government statistics, you can get census data, that's available online, population trends, so on and so forth, depending on how large scale your plan needs to be. Published sources, directories, annual reports, journals, financial professional institutes. There'll often be, actually, there's always an association for everything in Japan. So there's the shopping centre association, there's the optometrists association, there's this association, that association, and those people are often very helpful. Probably the phone doesn't ring that often sometimes in those places, and they'd be very happy to get an approach for some Genki JMEC people. So that there are lots of different places to go, and some syndicated services, which I was referring to before. You're not going to be able to buy that stuff, but your client may, and they may be prepared to buy it for you for the project. I don't know if I just said something I'm allowed to do, but I mean, you never know. So just work the client. They can probably help you. Key secondary sources, well, actually this is a bit old. As I said, this presentation's been given a lot, but I don't even think Nikkei Weekly still exists, but it is online. There is an online version, it's very good. But English language dailies, right, Japan Times, all of that kind of stuff. Your foreign chambers of commerce, of course, who a lot of them are sponsoring JMEC as well, they might be able to point you in the right direction as well. Your Japanese dailies, you can see, Nikkei Trendy. I don't know if these are still around, but you get the drift on what we're looking at. And right here, the Jetro library too. They should be able to help you. I don't think they speak English here, so you might need to get one of the Japanese members of your team to do it. But there's a wealth of information in Jetro. So variables to be aware of when you're looking at secondary research, so the modalities, so the units of measurement, the definition of key variables, the categories used. So one source that you look at might look at, just to give you a very simple example, one source might look at stuff in miles and the other one might look at it in kilometres. So don't make the rookie's mistake of, not doing the appropriate conversions, or, it's usually a little bit harder to detect than that, but you do have to be careful of that. How recent is it too? So you'll usually have trouble finding stuff that's younger than about 5 years old. So, sometimes if you can find something that's 5 years old, you're doing well. So if it's older than that, it could be good for inspiration. I don't know, it'll give you some, it gives you something. But yeah, it can be a little bit old. A lot of the time. And how dependable is it? So is it, is the source credible and reputable, and you'll find stuff on the internet that says, we've done surveys, and the number one thing that girlfriends hate in their boyfriend is, him throwing his socks at the wall or something, whatever it is. But, those kind of surveys are not particularly scientific. So just because something's quoted in a survey, of course, doesn't mean that that survey was properly conducted. Self-selecting surveys are really not reliable. So they're the surveys where people get to choose whether they answer the questions or not. One exception to that might be customer satisfaction work, but again, it's kind of interesting to debate whether the people that answer the surveys have a different biased than the people that don't answer them. So you have to look at the dependability of the source. Accuracy, you may want to check a number of different sources. If there's a particularly salient fact that is going to drive a lot of your decision making, you may want to check from other sources. There was about, I don't know, maybe about 10 years ago, there was a very widely quoted statistic that 97%, or not, maybe it was 92% of Japanese office ladies had a Louis Vuitton handbag. Now, you can sort of believe it, like, because a lot of those guys had a Louis Vuitton handbag, but the number was just not correct. But it got quoted and quoted and quoted. So you may want to just see if you can get that fact from another source as well, or get something that supports it. And yes, if you can get it, if there is some information on the methodology, if it's a particularly important fact that you're quoting. I mentioned at the beginning, observation can be good as well. So that may be, let's say, okay, I guess it's a retail example, but immersing yourself in the market might be good. So especially if it's consumer stuff, if it's business stuff, probably not that much. But I don't know, if it's an airline, maybe you want to go to the airport. I don't know. Just look at you're not usually thinking about the airline's business plan when you go to the airport, but maybe there's some kind of cute insight or something you can get out of that. So stuff like that I don't think is a complete waste of time. At least it may even just put you in the mood, which can be important as well. So your common challenges, as I mentioned, finding reliable and up-to-date sources, the age of the stuff that you find online and around the place can be a little bit too old to be useful. It can be inspiring but not useful, and it may not be exactly the right data points that you're looking for. It can be like tantalizingly close but not actually what you're looking for. It can be hard to size a market category that's relatively well defined in Western markets but in its infancy in Japan. And at the end of the day, while it's pregnant with possibilities, it seldom answers your questions directly, right? I really don't know why that image is still in this presentation, but anyway. Rather, it's very useful to give you a feel for the market and spark or test your early hypotheses. So I'm saying it's important, and it's useful potentially, but it's there to give you a feel for the market and to get you started. And for goodness sake, don't spend too much time on it. Move on. If you're having trouble with it, move on to the next stage, because you can actually still be looking for secondary research as you go through if once you've got a better idea of what you're looking for. But don't get stuck. I wouldn't get stuck on it. Or get too obsessed with it. So that's kind of like putting it in its proper context. But sort of helps us to get to hypotheses, I guess, So how do we define a hypothesis? It's a supposition about reality based on limited evidence. So I've just been discussing the problem of limited evidence, right? So then we have to make some guesses about stuff. Hypotheses, however, are the currency of progress, right? Because we don't always know everything. And I think that you don't want to feel completely shackled down to the facts when you come up with your plans as well. So if you're somebody that likes the comfort of facts and figures, it's good, but sometimes you've got to kind of leap off the page as well, and you've got to take that leap. And it's good if you can sort of tell the story of how you took that leap. I think that's always quite credible. But the best hypotheses are generated by smart people, so that's no problem here, but informed by exploratory research, such as we've been talking about. And they're not so useful until you've tested them as well. So we can have all sorts of hypotheses about things. What's an example of a hypothesis? So consumers today are looking for bigger screens on their smartphones. So again, you can see how dated this is. Like, it would be like, today, nobody wants a home button on their phone anymore. or people aren't prepared to pay $1,500 for a smartphone. That's a hypothesis. There's no evidence that they won't. We're starting to gather that now, but that's an example. Or men, you hear this all the time, men are increasingly prepared to spend more on clothes and grooming. And you've been hearing that for like the last 50 years, and it's still a very niche area. Or people don't, for example, people don't like our donuts because they're too sweet. You know, that's a hypothesis. Or why don't Japanese do X, Y, Z? Because like they're all suppositions, right? There's some evidence possibly, but they're just hypotheses. So qualitative research sort of is again, it sort of we're drawing into more kind of definite ideas, but we're still at the hypothesis generation stage a little bit when we do qualitative research. All it is talking and listening to people in a semi-structured manner. That's all it is. So having a chat with Betsy about her breakfast cereal and what she ate could be qualitative research. Especially if you're taping it, then we can call it research. But it's interacting with people, it's asking them questions, it's exploring their responses to things, how they do things, you know, what makes them tick, how does their industry work, you know, what things do they look for in a supplier if it's B2B, etc., etc. So it's talking and listening to people. Now, you can do that, right? So you can do qual. It's you know, you really can do it. If you can talk to people, you can do qualitative research. It's not quite that simple, but you know, basically. But the discussion is controlled using a discussion guide, usually, and the process is recorded for later reference. So in my company, I can't just go out and talk to people or send my people out to talk to people and say, this is what they said, just trust me. So there's usually a list of things that a client will want you to ask. And depending on what type of client they are, like some clients will want you'll have to ask every single thing on that guide. There could be a 5-page discussion guide. They want every single point covered. Or they may allow you some latitude in how you approach asking the questions. And you usually record the process too, because you might take notes when you're talking to people, but you can't remember everything that they said. But you have to remember, if you're doing a lot of these sessions, you're going to end up with hours and hours and hours and hours of recordings. And on some projects that we do, we routinely end up with 24 hours of recordings or more. So we don't even have people in our team who are professional researchers who can spend the time to listen to 24 hours of recordings. So you need to sort of remember or be really paying attention when you're speaking to people, but do record your interview too, because you might want to go back. There could be a killer quote there. There could be the quote that proves everything in terms of what you want to do and your plan, and he said it so you can believe it, and you know, that can be quite powerful, quite direct quotations when you're justifying stuff. And that can be one-on-one, and for most of you, one-on-one will be the easier approach, because it's easier to make an appointment with one person than it is to get 5 or 6 people in a room. I'll talk a little bit later about the benefit of a one-on-one versus a group, but you know, both are perfectly good and valid ways of doing things, but one-on-ones are easier, and you'll probably find yourself doing more one-on-ones, I would say. So qual should not be used to measure or predict anything, and that's kind of something that I can't always get away with telling my clients who are very, very sort of set on the way that they look at qual. But qual, because then people say, well, what's the value of it if you can't predict anything based on it? But it actually has a lot of value, because you're really exploring what the sort of the boundaries of the issue are, and what the range of opinions are, and the range of possibilities, and the dynamics of decision making in the category. What it's best for is best used for to service the range of views and behaviour. on a certain category. So we're not saying this is the predominant view from qual, we're saying people said this. These are the things that people talked about. These are the things that people are tending to say are important. This is what people have said is important in this particular business-to-business situation, or these are the things that I'm looking for in a supplier. We're not saying this is the number one important one, but hey, if something comes up every single time you speak to people in a qualitative setting, then you can start to, again, form a hypothesis that actually this is the key driving idea. And from that, yeah, you should be able to expand and better inform your hypotheses. So just this cartoon here is saying how many of you would buy this so that we get the projected sell-in, trial penetration, repeat numbers we need to justify making it. So that's not what you do in a focus group or in a qualitative setting, right? So you're not asking for quantification. When you do measurement research, that's when you're doing quantification. So once we have a handle on the range of opinions in a category and a feel for the overall category dynamics, we might want to put some sizes and probabilities on those. So that's putting the sizes and probabilities on things is what we use surveys for. So qual, again, is like just conversations with people. It could be one-on-one, could be in a group. We're just listening to what people are saying. We're focusing on what we think are the key themes coming through those conversations. Quantitative research is about coming to some actual conclusions. It's the scary end of research because you actually have to say this is more important than that. So taste is more important than colour in that lollipop, for example. We're very good at telling that kind of thing with quantitative research. And also sound measurement is useful to gaining credibility for your plans as well. So one of the teams I mentored one year, a very long time ago, they did a very good survey. It was a very, very good survey. It was very well written. They did a good job of administering it. And I thought, oh, okay, you know, that's pretty good. I think they did a good job. Sort of like my credibility is a bit on the line too, because I'm supposed to do this for a living, and I mentored them, and then they went and they presented to the judges, and they had 17 respondents. And the judge said, well, you've only got 17 respondents. And I was like, oh, I never actually thought to check how many people they were interviewing. It all happened so quickly, you couldn't possibly have asked me that. But actually, you have to make sure that you've done it properly. Otherwise, you know, the credibility that you might seek to get by putting some numbers in front of people won't actually work for you. And as I mentioned earlier on, you're not always going to have the opportunities to do a survey that will allow you to say definitively what you might want to say. There might not be enough people to talk to, or it might simply just not be appropriate for your project. And we can help you decide which it is. There's another session that comes in sometime in the process where we have a check-in on the research and we can talk about stuff like that. But quantitative research uses surveys to measure market characteristics, attitudes, and behaviours. A questionnaire is the instrument we use at this stage. So hands up, who's filled out a questionnaire before? Wow, there's some people who haven't, or they've got lazy arms. I can't believe nobody has filled out a survey before. And that's quant, right? Really easy. So qual is talking to people, quant is when I'm ticking boxes, or doing it online, or filling out an enquête at Tully's, or whatever it is. And as I said before, questionnaires should usually not be used for exploratory purposes because you've already defined the parameters of inquiry in a questionnaire. So when do you use qual or quant? I think it's really driven by whether you're building your theories, or building your ideas, or testing them. So when you know less, you should do more qual. When you know more, generally speaking, you might want to do quant. So you might be having a debate in your team as to which is the right direction. I have a couple of clients at the moment, a couple of different clients. One is One is a world-famous environmental organisation, and they are looking at a hot-button environmental issue, and they don't know how they should talk about it. But they know this topic really well. So, and we've done qual work for them. So now they're like, well, should we say this, or should we say this, or should we say this? So we'll basically get 3 different ways of approaching their particular issue, and we'll test them among a valid sample, a decent sample of everyday consumers, and say, here's the response to this one, and we compare it to this one, and we compare it to this one across different cells, and we look for statistically significant differences across the cells. And that's a really great way of deciding sometimes which idea got the bigger number. Can work pretty well. We do. I've done a lot of testing of ads in my career as well. So you can sometimes, I've done projects where there are 10 ads. The client wants to test 10 ads. Which one is the one that's going to work the best? So you can argue till the cows come home, looking at qualitative research and looking at what people said and what they didn't say, or I saw this bit, no, I don't remember saying that, let's go back and check the recording. I distinctly remember that person in Fukuoka said that she washed her hair 3 times a week, whatever. So quant can sort of help you make decisions when there are sort of competing ideas as well. And every category and every situation is different. However, if you haven't got the picture already, qual usually comes before quant. Although sometimes you'll do quant and then you do qual after that. So you may sort of work out, okay, what's the most promising direction, and then qualitative work may be used to further develop the idea. Just to compare and contrast, we're using qual to explore how buyers make decisions in your category, to surface what's important to them, what are the basic emotional reactions people have to the category and your ideas, and how do buyers position your offer among alternatives. So an example is we've just done a project for a company that is a cleaning products company, and we did some very basic research in people's homes in terms of looking at how do people clean their homes, how does the housewife, because it often still is a housewife in Japan, how does she work, and we found out that she doesn't like all-purpose cleaners. There's like the green one for this bit, there's the white one for this bit, there's the yellow one. I don't know what they're for. They all look about the same to me, but they all have a different purpose, and this one has a different rag to this one, and they don't want to get the house too clean. They actually want to just kind of have a more gentle kind of way of cleaning and whatever. So when our client comes in with this hugely powerful cleaner whose claim is it'll clean anything from horribly filthy to sparkly white, just by going like this, most consumers recoil in horror in Japan at that idea. So then, of course, you have to explain to the foreign marketing director why people don't actually want things to be too clean. And of course, there are good reasons for that, and so on and so forth. But that's what qual is for. So how do I, when I'm buying a cleaning product, what am I looking for? Oh, I would like it to be gentle, or I'd like it to be fit to purpose. I'd like it to do so on and so forth. Oh, basic emotional reactions. Well, cleaning's my job. I'm a housewife, so that's what I do. Right. So don't take my work away from me by giving me a strong all-in-one cleaner, or don't give me something that is scary or caustic, is going to burn my fingerprints off, or whatever. So that's the kind of stuff that we do in qual. In contrast, in quant, what we're doing is we're doing things like calibrating market size, or calibrating potential amount of potential buyers you might have for an idea. So a typical approach would be, here's a survey, here's our concept, we are an all-in-one cleaner that will, just with a wipe, will clean caked in dirt on your surfaces. And how likely would you be to buy that? Or maybe 5% might say they're likely. So what's 5% of the of the market in cleaning products. Okay, if we get to that number. It's not quite, actually, it's a lot more complicated than that, but in broad principle, that's how it works. You're establishing facts about the market. People on average clean their bathrooms 4.8 times a week. Actually, no one I know does that, but it's an example of it. I just made that up. But that's the kind of thing you do, and you quote it, it's quotable. The relative strength of perceptions. Okay, so cleaning power is less important than safety, for example. It's the kind of thing you can measure in quant. You can show relationships. You can look at the relationship between price and likelihood of purchase. You can look at how that curve goes at different price points. So what's our optimal price? What's our optimal sort of demand curve for this product? You can do that in quant too. And also to predict outcomes. So I just gave you an example about that, but another outcome might be an advertising test, for example. We may, an insurance company may have a new type of policy that they want to advertise. Here it is. Here, maybe it's a 60-second infomercial. Here's why it's good. Here's how it's different from other policies. Here's why you should call your agent today. Type of thing. How likely are you to buy? Is a very direct question we can ask, and we can compare that because we have hundreds of other ads where we've asked the same question. So you're above average, you're below average for a typical ad like that among that particular type of consumer. So that's an example of predicting an outcome.
Excuse me. Was the tolerance of such kind of quantitative research is it acceptable? For example, 20%, 30%.
In terms of what's the magic number?
Yeah. See,
yeah.
For example, you say the relative strength. If two numbers come out very close to each other, how do you evaluate these two numbers?
Well, it depends entirely on the situation and how the client looks at it. I mean, I've had clients that will make decisions based on differences that are completely statistically insignificant, but simply because one is higher than the other. And hey, it gives you at least some decision criteria, even if legitimately it's meaningless if you know about the laws of sampling. But you hope in your design so that things don't come up like that. So when you get into more sophisticated questionnaire design, you'll be looking at ways of doing that so that you are able to rank things effectively, and that you're not, when they're very close, you can sort of get an idea of how really close they are in reality. And actually, it's good that you asked a question because we've got question time now. So, are there any questions to do with anything that I have presented so far? Yeah.
Going to your secondary sources, I know they're listed, but is there any rank of most useful in research to probably, topical, depending on what it is? And I think you mentioned internal and external. So maybe government stats are really easy to find, or like articles and things like that. But maybe some of the projects that have been in the past, maybe they couldn't be used so easily.
I think like categories in certain industries have their kind of like star publications. So it would be good to know who those publications are. I mean, I was almost going to say Google. So yeah, I would say just Google it and see what comes up. And the top ranking stuff on Google is usually there for a reason. I have no idea how you get top ranking. I couldn't possibly comment on a client. But yeah, I think it's not a bad starting point, and then you can start to map things out, and also going to the association in the industries. It's very hard for me to be specific because I don't know what your projects are. Some of them may be much easier to find that kind of info than others. But Google's not a bad start. But then, of course, when you speak to people, when you start kind of approaching people about your research, you can ask them what the sources are too. And I'd ask the client too what they consider to be credible. Or they might say, well, in America we look at this one and that's our Bible. And so then you might find the equivalent in Japan. Something like that.
Yeah, I have one more. You mentioned observation. I think last week someone said, go out and talk to the customers and things like that. Is it better to just watch, or is it better to watch and then interact?
Well, as long as you don't get arrested. I mean, that's always my advice when my guys go out. I'll do something creative so they get in trouble. Yeah, I don't know. I think you've got to be aware that when you're speaking to people, like you have a purpose for speaking to them. So you just need to be aware of the boundaries of like correct behaviour in that context. So they're not obliged to cooperate with you. And so you need to be transparent about why you're talking to them. But hey, if you've got people who are kind of would fit into, it wouldn't be weird, then sure, why not? But just, to make sure that that's a respectful interaction, I think is important. So any other questions? Yes?
When you create a hypothesis, this is usually like create a hypothesis in a way that should be accepted or rejected, because there is also confirmation bias when we do the supporting data.
Well, it would be well, so it's kind of sad if it gets rejected if you've put a lot of work into it. So I don't think it's always black and white, but I think you can always go back and improve your hypothesis as well. So it's rare, I think, that people have to completely start again, but then again, you can get a bit of a steer to, see if you're on the right course or not. So you may be, for example, like an airline looking at a new route or something, and you may have a hypothesis that it's all leisure or it's all business, or hey, it looks like it's leisure, but hey, there's a lot of business, or it looks like it's business, but actually there's a hidden leisure potential here. Like that's an example of a hypothesis. And you might go into the market and find there's absolutely no interest in flights to that destination from leisure people, not even hidden interest, right? Just a very, very, very easy example there. Any other questions? Yep.
We created a qualitative and quantitative questionnaire sheet. Before you go for survey, do you already assume what's your reaction to the result? Do you assume how to interpret each result? Or only after that you do the interpretation when you collect all the data?
Yeah, often afterwards is when you sort of have to think about that. You don't know going into, unless you've asked that question before many times, you may not know what the response will be going ahead. Or
but in this case, you on purpose prepare some questions. So you should know why you ask these questions and what's the potential meaning behind it.
Yes, well, yeah, I mean, that's common sense. You should do that. But you don't know whether, you still don't know whether people are going to understand your question until you ask them, or what it means, or the answer is very different than what you expected. But yes, it's a good point. You might want to try the questionnaire out on people as well, just to make sure that you've created the same meaning in your question as you're hoping to get.
For such kind of questions, do you discuss with your customer before you go for survey, or after you go for survey, then you just show the result?
The client always approves the questionnaire. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
About the sample size, in your experience, what is the average size that?
I would say you'd want to go for a minimum of about 50. Theoretically, you can go as low as 30. But it depends, if there are 10 buyers in your category and you get to survey 10 of them, then that's a census, right? It's not a sample. So it depends on what you can get. It's just that you want the data that comes back to be meaningful and to be interpretable. And if it's a very small you can only get very small samples, you may want to look at doing a qualitative approach rather than a survey. Or you can add a hard question on the end of a qualitative survey as well. So, anyone else? Yeah.
For secondary research, you were saying we wouldn't find research that's new. So would quoting something that's 5 years old in our participant, would that be too old?
If that's all you can find, and it's a killer fact, then I think that that's okay. But you may want to do some triangulation of that through your primary interviews.
But something that's 10 years old is definitely too old. Yeah.
Well, you can say this is what it was 10 years ago, and we don't think it's changed that much, and the people that we spoke to didn't think it had changed very much. That's a possibility. All right. So we have another half hour before the break, so I've got more. So how would you go about conducting these primary interviews that we were saying would be a good idea for you to do once you've done your secondary research? So before recruiting and conducting the interviews, you need to develop your list of potential targets. And you can refine that over time. Where are you going to get that? Yes, it could be from secondary data, or it could be people who spoke at a conference, for example. And often those people who speak at conferences, you'll be able to get their email address. Or you can guess it because they're from Microsoft and it's all at Microsoft.com or whatever it is. So you need to develop your list. Then you need to develop your interview guide or your discussion guide. So what are we going to talk about? We're not just going to go there and talk about the weather, although you may want to start off by talking about the weather because you actually need to get rapport with people before they'll speak to you in the way that you want them to. So there's usually a bit of a warm-up in your guide. You can even write it in there, talk about the weather, or make a complimentary comment about their office, or keep it appropriate, but something that will build rapport with them. And when we do focus groups in our company, they'll always be, hi, tell us about your family, my daughter's going to university and she's studying hard and she doesn't have a boyfriend and I'm happy about that, or whatever, and then the others go, like mine too, and so that you've built that kind of rapport, which is useful to go deeper with people. When you're recruiting people, allow time to send, well, I don't think any of you are going to send a letter, but send an email in advance, but you've got to allow time. They may not read it. I often don't read emails now because I just get too many of them. So, if it's really important, people find another way to talk to you. But you've got to leave time for that. Oh, he didn't open my email, or he didn't get back to me, or he did get back to me, or his assistant got back to me, or so you need to have enough time for that. You need to identify yourself as a JMEC participant and be prepared to explain JMEC succinctly. You may want to practice your script on that. We are blah, blah, blah. Explain that you cannot reveal the name of the client, but that you would appreciate their cooperation. And not revealing the name of the client makes it difficult for people to talk to you. They generally don't want to talk to you if you can't say who the research is for. But this is why you need to do the explanation about JMEC. And then you offer to visit according to their schedule, not your schedule. In terms of the design of the questionnaire and the discussion guide, so you design the questionnaire to fit the medium, right? If we are doing a questionnaire. So if it's a self-completion questionnaire, then you'll write it differently. There'll be a different way that you phrase the questions versus if you're asking somebody off a questionnaire over the phone or face-to-face. The KISS, simple. The principle, keep it short and simple. Must know, nice to know, can do without, right? So long questionnaires are terrible, don't do them. Start with a good introduction or welcome message. Allow don't know or not applicable responses to questions that need it. Include other or none of the above when either is a logically possible answer, especially with opinions. Develop a natural, logical flow of questions. You generally move from general topics into more specific topics. And keep the questions simple and straightforward. And again, keep the timing and volumes of questions in mind. So you may want to try it out on other team members, or try it out on your mum or your dad or your brother or sister or your friend or whatever. In terms of your interviewing skills, as I said, you need to gain the respondents' rapport, interest and trust. Reassure them of the confidentiality of the process and their answers. Especially if you're recording it too, you have to doubly reassure them. And if you are recording it, you need to put the recorder on the table in front of you. Encourage spontaneous, honest answers. Be careful not to lead to desired answers, so you don't say things like, "You think this, don't you?" Or, "Everyone we've spoken to says this, so what do you..." You think the same, don't you? Don't use unfamiliar words or expressions with people, and probe for reasons why, and be careful about making assumptions. This is one of the classic things that you need to do when you're doing interview and market research. If they say no, you say why? Say yes, can you tell me more about that? Can you tell me more about that? Can you tell me more about that? Until, they're about to throw you out. In a nice way, keeping all of those other rules in mind, but don't let them off with a lazy answer. You may need to probe them more. In terms of web surveys, I think we're all aware there are several packages around that do this for free, so Question Pro, SurveyMonkey, so on and so forth. One of the really good things now about online surveys is there'll be any number of resources that will tell you how to write questions and give you sample questions. So I really don't have to sit down or stand up and give you like really, really detailed training on how to write questions, because it's all, just go to Question Pro and there's templates and the work's being done for you. But don't, just because it's easy doesn't mean you necessarily abuse it or ask every single question that they have on their template. But that you'll get a good sense for how to write a good question from that. But keep the things I said before in mind. Go from general to more specific in your flow. Keep the questionnaires brief and user-friendly. Legitimate sampling is the hardest challenge that you'll find. So snowballing techniques are okay, which is where it's like, okay, you filled out the survey. Do you have a friend that seems like you? Can you get them to do the survey too? They're probably, it may actually be all that you can do. But you do need to show that your sample really does represent your target market.
It's like a thing in that.
Yes, they thought of everything. Okay. So let's get hands-on. We've still got 20 minutes, so we're a little bit ahead of schedule, which is great. But I just want to check in again. Does anyone have any questions about anything that I've spoken about so far, or do you have any comments or challenges or anything of that nature? Yeah.
If you want to do on website survey, do you have some limits that roughly how long time the people has to contribute? Because if it's too lengthy and they will just give up at the end.
Yeah, I would say as a rule 10 to 15 minutes
10 to 15 minutes
is about right. It depends on how interesting the topic is to the respondent. So let's say if I'm suffering from a certain disease and you give me a questionnaire about my disease and what it's like to live with it, I might answer a 1-hour questionnaire for you. if it's a boring topic and you give me 10,000 yen, I might spend an hour with it. So there are a number of factors, but if you're doing it for free, short and simple is absolutely the best way. So in my company, every time we finish a project, we send a survey to our client. We say, how was the project? And it's one question with an open-ended question. It's like, how likely would you be to recommend this agency? Yeah, click. And that's it. So you really, shorter is better. So you really need to be, it's another reason why you shouldn't be using questionnaires for exploratory research, because you have to ask a lot of questions in exploratory research, and they may not be the right questions. So you'll find out they were not the right questions if it doesn't work in your survey, if you know, 60% say don't know in the survey. Yes?
I was wondering if you have, for example, a client that does something very specific. Last week we had Finnish log houses, for example.
Yes.
And you do a survey or something where it's very obvious perhaps who they are. How do you work around that in terms of keeping them anonymous?
Disguising the client.
Yeah.
Well, sometimes it's hard to do. And the clients will have varying kind of sort of opinions on the level of confidence. I mean, JMEC is a blanket confidential, right? That's part of the deal. But there may be some flexibility with the client as well. Or that just may be, it is what it is. But you just need to make sure that you've not done anything that's in contravention of what you've agreed to do. So even if it's obvious, even if it's, you know, we're doing a survey and they're a very large search engine, you know, who is it? Or, you know, something like that. Yeah, but you just need to make sure that you don't overstep and no one could accuse you of having done the wrong thing. Any other questions? Yeah.
You mentioned if you like pay money, people will like be wanting to like faster to do your survey. Would you suggest to incentivize with like, I don't know, cookies or something like that?
Yeah, sure. I think that's a great idea. Yeah, and in fact, you know, incentivizing surveys makes the sample more legitimate, not less legitimate, because you've got to think about who would fill out a survey for no reason. You know, we don't know that, like the questions we don't really want to ask very often in research, right? We do what we can, right? We do the best job that we can, but incentivizing surveys is usually a very good idea in some way. Even just with your gratitude. Any other questions? Guy, what about from the back of the room? Yes, I've been looking at you the whole time. No? No questions? Nothing? Yep.
Like a specific question, like I know there are services where you can opt in if you want to answer surveys and get some incentive. Are there any good sources that you know that would maybe give us even categories of people, or you know, kind of get like a kind of targeted audience and get that example?
Well, there are many, but you have to pay for them,
Right.
unfortunately. So you may have to pay like could be 500. I mean, we pay less because we do hundreds of thousands of interviews, but it could be 1,000 yen for one interview. It could be 500 yen for one interview. It just depends on how long it is and who you're talking to. So, I mean, if you do, you probably won't have the budget, put it that way, to do it. But those services are there, for sure. There are companies where their entire business is based on curating out interesting people to talk to.
I was thinking like even incentivize people like with a lottery, let's say, with like 10,000 yen and like have okay, we'll be asking 1,000 people, one person will get like
Yeah, I mean, you can try.
We get those like
Yep.
email.
Yep, there's nothing wrong with that as an idea. I mean, you just have to, in fact, I recently spoke to a lawyer about whether that's legal in Japan, and it is. You could think about doing stuff like that as well. Just depends on, you know, whether that's appropriate. You wouldn't do it for a B2B scenario. But you may say, I'll donate money to your favourite charity something like that. But generally, I'd steer clear so much of the financial side of things. I think you need to be able to encourage people to sort of do it because, you know, they're inspired by the story of JMEC and want to help you. If you can get there in this tough world. Any other questions? Yes, Betsy.
What about using sort of, you know, Facebook has advertisements, it's not that expensive, like, you know, put your advertisement and target really specifically even within Japan or in this area, and then link it to a survey?
Yes, I think you can do that. I don't have any objection to that as a methodology, as long as you're clear about how you did it, and you know, generally you'll want to control the sample that you're speaking to. So you may want to curate it a little bit so that you're kind of getting a mix of people in there that's more representative, so that it's just not, you know, if you're talking to me, it's just not 40-something-year-old men. Or so you may need to do a little bit of throwing out of certain, you may collect more than what you need, is what I'm saying, through those methods, and then you sort of curate it back so that you've got a representative sample. Anything else? Yeah.
I have a quick question for like Facebook surveys. Isn't that like you need to pay? It's not free, right?
Well, yeah, I don't actually know. Yeah, I guess you probably do. So if you've got the money, you can pay, but you probably don't.
Like this JMEC program, they won't allow any expenses to do surveys.
Yeah, I can't. You get about 50,000 or something, don't you? Yeah.
So, yeah, you have your budget for 50,000, yeah, and you use it however you want. But some people who wanted to do by market research, they would then go to their company and propose, can you pay us Iman or Saman for whatever that was. So yes, you are restricted, but if you think you can get better research, then you speak with your company that is sponsored.
But you may also find just sharing stuff on Facebook, just sharing the survey link on Facebook among your friends or among someone who you feel is representative of that target, and get them to share it among their friends. I mean, it's certainly one way of doing it, and you may have a mix of methodologies too. You may source some of it from Facebook. You may have a list of emails that someone else gives you. You may have to call people up and say, could you do my survey? So again, I will put it this way, I don't think it's a slam dunk decision that you need to actually even do a survey. And you know, you can see now as we're talking through some of the practicalities of it, you may find that that's not actually the best way to get the information or the inspiration that you require. For some it may be. It just depends. Yep.
Just before you end the survey topic, we have this Facebook. We're talking about this right now, but then will they ask about the reliability of this surveys that you said that you?
I would.
Right.
If I were paying for it, I would. Yeah. So you need to tell your story straight, and you need to be realistic about, you know, how representative I mean, there are different technical issues in surveys. You know, there's representativeness, there's reliability, there's validity, there's, you know, all sorts of things. But you just want to, I think, be transparent about the steps that you've taken to arrive at those data that you're presenting. And then if you feel that there's a caveat or like a warning that you need to put on the data, that you say, well, look, we know that these people were younger, so we want to tell you that that's what we have in this survey. We know that young people might not be the only target for this service, but that's who we could get on Facebook. Something like that. It's just if you're if you're open about what the, you know, what the warts on your data are, I think it's okay. I think having some data points is better than having no data points. It's knowing how to place that in context and how to explain that in a credible way. And those discussions can get out of control as well. It won't get out of control for you, but it can get out of control. with clients when you have to start doing that, because say, well, why did you do that, and you know, blah blah blah. So you've got to have your story straight on that. But your mentor should be able to help you to get the story straight, and we can help you too. So, all right. Anything else? Yeah.
Sorry. In the company that I work for now, we did a survey on the street, and we had really hard time to finding out actually about the legality of doing it. Like, is it allowed by Japanese law to approach people?
You're meant to ask the police if you go into. So you should go to the Korban and just say, look, we've got this survey and we're going to be approached. That's the right way to do it. Normally, research companies, they'll have their arrangements anyway, but there are methodologies where they'll grab people off the street and get them to come upstairs to a room to do a survey. They call it like a street catch methodology. So certainly it can be done, but you need to make sure that you've done the appropriate groundwork to make sure that you don't upset people.
Databases that already have a number of surveys, like in the last 5 years, of certain trends that are accessible by the public?
Yeah, there are. I mean, some of the newspaper companies have surveys, and like I said before, it's just you want to be aware of the source, and you may have to discount it if by saying, well, look, it was an unscientific poll done by this online company, but they said this, but we also found this other source that came up with a fairly similar finding, so we think it's okay. So yeah, you'll be surprised what you'll find on there. Like, just Google, like, when I'm working on something, sometimes I just Google like the actual question I want to answer. Like, it's amazing what comes out. So just Google, you know, what's going to come up, and then you sort of go from there. And sometimes there are published surveys that could certainly be of use. For things like tourism, why did you come to Japan, right? I would imagine there's lots of published surveys around on that. What are your favourite attractions in Japan when you come to Japan? Where are you from? You know, that sort of stuff is probably likely to be widely available. So we have 5 more minutes before the break. So are there any burning questions that remain? Yes?
It's not actually a question, but I just want to say, for those of you, depending on your company and the product, another thing you can do is actually look for, like, if people wrote thesis on that specific industry or topic, and often they've done quite an extensive marketing research and gather data on that. So if you can find, usually the theses, you can find them online. And then you can have an idea of where to go, which direction to look at, etc.
Okay, that's an amazing suggestion.
Yes, also if there are books, and these books cost a lot of money, but if you read the abstract, they'll give you an abstract in the beginning or the first few pages. And then from that you can get hints on specific target areas. You'll know what to look for and what to research or what catchphrases to use, etc. But if any of you want techniques, I used to do research, so you can come and ask me and I'll give you ideas how to find research techniques.
Right, yeah, very, very good. Very, very good suggestions. Thank you for that. Okay, so anything else before the break?
Yeah.
Yes.
I have a question. Do you think the web survey with an anonymous, the survey result can be still reliable, do you think?
Well, it depends. It depends. Like, if you go to a reputable company like a Macromill or Cross Marketing or one of those sorts of companies, you know, they are paid to look after the integrity of their panels, and I must assume that they are legitimate. But of course, when you don't know who's on the other end of the survey, there are legitimate questions as to whether that person is who they say that they are. The other question is like, how many surveys have they done? Because there are people that just do surveys all week, and that's how they earn their money. It's actually hard work because you've got to fill out a lot of surveys to do that. So I think there are questions over who in fact that person is, and you may be asked that question. And then, as I said before, you know, if you don't know, well, that's just because that was the best that you could do, and that's got to be good enough. It's probably better than nothing. So there are unknowns in life, but of course you try to take the appropriate precautions to make sure that you've got a legitimate sample behind it. Yes?
Yeah. Do you think there's anything different about doing market research in Japan as compared to in other countries?
Well, it's becoming more similar over time, but when I first started, generally, let's say people in focus group situations, for example, were not as verbal and didn't speak as much as they did compared to what I was used to, coming from Australia. And that seems to have changed over time a bit. You use all the same methodologies in Japan as you do overseas, so it's generally quite okay to use the same approaches, but there are differences in people's engagement levels or how they engage and so on and so forth. But I used to hear you could never do work in Japanese houses, and you know, now routinely we'll go into houses and there'll be 5 or 6 people coming into the house, and it's okay, it's totally fine. One area that you need to be aware of is that when you administer rating scales to Japanese, they tend to use them differently than English speakers. So if you've got a scale that says from excellent to poor, the Japanese respondent is less likely than let's say the American respondent to say something is excellent, even if it's the same thing. So you want to be aware of that if you have a mixed sample, if you have a mixed sample of Japanese and foreigners. The foreigners are, if they're rating the same, if it's a domain of performance, let's say, the foreigner is more likely to rate up, and the Japanese is more likely to rate closer to the middle of the scale. But they may still feel the same level of, you know, satisfaction or the same response. So that happens, and you may, for that reason, want to look at the data among Japanese and foreigners separately, if that becomes an issue. But things like, you know, how many times do you drink Coke a week? You know, that's not going to be subject to a cultural bias. But how much do you enjoy drinking Coke may be subject to a bias, or the difference may be simply a difference in response on average to the scale from this culture versus the other culture. So just keeping, if you do, it's a good point. If you're doing a mixed sample, I would look at them together and look at the data together, and then look at them separately, just to make sure that there isn't a bias there. Okay.